then while I was in college, I studied anthropology, which does not necessarily make sense if you want to go be a baker, but I thought it was interesting. And that's where I was introduced to anthropology of food as a discipline. And that is what started sparking some questions around communion and the Eucharist, and just interest in sort of how does my love of food and how does my love of bread specifically function in conversation with my love of communion and the fact that the church is sort of built around this meal.
Hi, everyone. This is Dana Black.
And this is Chelsea Simon.
Welcome to the Collective Table.
It's Chelsea here. Dana and I are so glad that you have tuned into this second episode in our new season called What God Looks Like. Throughout this interview series, we will get an inside look at the beautiful diversity of God through the various ways that Christians show up in the world. In this specific episode, Dana and I sit down with Kendall Vanderslice. She is the founder of Edible Theology, which offers bread workshops, Bible curriculum, online community, and other resources that are designed for Christians curious about the theological depth of food. She is also the author of We Will Feast, Rethinking Dinner, Worship, and the Community of God. In this conversation, we really dig into the ways in which food can be used to help us connect to the world, one another, ourselves, and God. Kendall shares about the sacredness of food and the ways in which it can enliven and enlighten our lives. We hope you enjoy it. Maybe let's just start, if you can share just a little bit about your background, how did you grow up? Did you grow up in a faith tradition? Kind of what were some of the practices, especially, around food and food and faith, if that was like a childhood thing or maybe like that.
Yeah, so my family is longtime Baptists. I have my grandfather is a Baptist minister, and several of my uncles and cousins are all Baptist ministers as well. So I grew up in a Christian family, grew up going to church regularly, and in sort of Baptist tradition, especially, I grew up in Texas. So Baptist tradition in Texas, we were eating all the time. So, meals were always kind of a part of just the church life. Food was definitely not something that was sort of acknowledged explicitly in faith tradition. It was just part of our rhythms, potlucks all the time. My grandmother has this massive collection of church cookbooks from all the churches where my grandfather was a pastor for years. So it was never really an explicit part of the sort of my growing up, but it was always sort of woven into just the life of faith.
So the Baptists do potlucks too, because the Methodists, that's a big thing for Methodists.
I think it probably is for lots of folks, right? I think it's probably a big thing for most churches.
Yeah, if you have food, they will come.
Yes.
If you have food, they will come. That is so true.
Whenever I was a kid, it was like, oh, Donuts Sunday, we showed up.
Yes.
And we still do that. Donuts and coffee Sunday all the time.
Our children's church growing up, our version of Sunday school, you got donuts if you came. So there was always incentive. I think maybe you had to memorize a Bible verse or something. So, our spirituality was rewarded with food all the time.
There's a very close connection with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We're in Texas.
I was in Dallas.
Where did you go after Dallas?
So then we moved to St. Louis. Okay. So I lived in St. Louis while in middle school and high school. And then my parents now live up in New England. Actually, they live in the Boston area. So moved around a lot.
When you moved to St. Louis, did you recognize the cultural difference in churches between Dallas and St. Louis? They're pretty different.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, we had been going to a pretty evangelical church in Dallas. And then when we moved to St. Louis, we started attending a Presbyterian church. So even just the shift from sort of a more evangelical to more liturgical was the kind of church we were in more so than, that's probably why we felt the difference even more than just Dallas versus St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. What was was there a reason for the change, or you just that was the best fit? Because that is a pretty big change.
Yeah, it was just the church my parents found and liked.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Okay, yeah.
When was it in your life that you kind of, for Christianity for yourself, kind of became the real thing?
Mm-hmm. I think I was always very interested. I was always asking questions. I was always, I loved Sunday school and I loved reading. I was
Mhm.
reading everything I could on my own, even sort of in middle school. I was homeschooled fourth grade through eighth grade. And so I was given a lot of flexibility to sort of read what I wanted to read. And so I was just always very curious. And so I think sort of that curiosity and the faith sort of went hand in hand. So I don't really know if there's a specific time when it really sort of took off for me. I think I was always just very curious and interested in probing sort of these various streams of thought.
That was me too. Like when I was in Sunday school, I was like, I can't believe Jesus is a person that did these. It was just like always mind
Mhm,
blowing. It was just part of me. We grew up in church too, and it was just like
mhm.
there's something that just gets embedded for some of us that just,
Yeah,
that's like
I think once I went to seminary, I thought that it was very funny to me, like that I had decided that I wanted to go to seminary when I was in my sort of mid 20s, and I was like, oh, I think I really want to study theology. And then once I started, I realized like, oh no, I've been doing this since I was like 6. Like, this seemed funny to me, but it didn't seem funny to anyone else in my life because I'd always been sort of reading and asking questions and sort of going down these like thought paths that were very theological in nature. And so, it makes sense in retrospect. It's sort of always been interesting to me.
So, what was there something that kind of propelled you to, move into seminary, or was it just a natural progression for where your mind was at the time, or?
Yeah, so I was always interested in food, and I was always interested in doing the work in food. I knew I wanted to become a professional baker really from the time I was in high school.
Oh.
And so while I took a gap year after high school, and I worked for an organization called Mercy Ships, which is a hospital ship on the coast of West Africa. And I was a baker. I worked as a baker and a barista on board the ship. So most kids who take a gap year to do work there want to go into the medical field. I was kind of unique in that I wanted to do something other than college, and this is what I could do. And then I ended up getting to bake while I was there, and I think that's where I was really able to sort of lean a little bit more into my interest in sort of pursuing baking as a vocation. And then while I was in college, I studied anthropology, which does not necessarily make sense if you want to go be a baker, but I thought it was interesting, and that's where I was introduced to anthropology of food as a discipline. So I started thinking
Mm.
about food a little bit more broadly in terms of sort of food and identity and the ways that we understand ourselves in relationship to food. And that is what started sparking some questions around communion and the Eucharist, and just interest in sort of how does my love of food and how does my love of bread specifically function in conversation with my love of communion and the fact that the church is sort of built around this meal. So then at that point, I still didn't think I was interested in theology. I was interested in food. And so I did a degree in food studies while I was working as a baker and started researching dinner churches. And I think it was as I was doing my research on dinner churches and as I was writing my book, We Will Feast, that's when I began to realize like, oh, my questions are definitely deeper than sort of what I can do just by knowing how to bake bread and by, attending church. I actually have some theological questions that go along with this. And so that's what ended up bringing me to Duke.
I think in my mind, I had it that you went to seminary first, and that's what kind of pole vaulted you into your book and the work. And what I'm hearing is the exact opposite. It was really food, the baking, your passion for the sacrament, and your work with dinner churches that got you. That was a good reversal. I didn't understand that. Okay. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. So the food stuff came first, and then sort of the seminary flowed out of that. I actually graduated from seminary, and then 3 days later the book came out. So timing
Oh,
wise, I think people tend to think that I did them at the same time, but it
yeah.
was actually the book was done, sort of finished by
First.
the time I finished writing it in my first semester at Duke.
Yeah,
Got
I
it.
I
Okay.
love the book. We actually do dinner church, Dana and I, and
Yeah.
have read about St. Lydia's and Garden Church, and I hadn't heard about the other ones. But your first experience is really with the Simple Church. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about you were actively seeking dinner church, I'm guessing, to find something, and then maybe tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you.
Yeah, so I learned about dinner churches while I was at Boston University doing my degree in food studies. And I was interested, sort of my focus while I was at Boston was on the social dynamics of eating together. I was interested in what is it about a meal, what is it about eating together that changes the ways that we interact with one another and impacts our ability to get to know one another. And around that time is when Rachel Held Evans' book, that I can't remember the name of it, but she writes about St. Lydia's in it. And so I heard about St. Lydia's, and that was when I thought, like, oh, dinner church, this really sort of pulls the pieces together. And so that became the most explicit way that I could start to look at sort of my interest in meals and my interest in communion. And so then I just started talking about dinner church all the time and St. Lydia's and how I thought this place was so fascinating. And some other friends of mine who had also been at Boston University, but at the divinity school had said, hey, well, there's a dinner church that's just outside of Boston. It had just been started by another pastor in the Boston area. And so they took me out to Simple Church. They were friends with the pastor, and that's where I connected with Pastor Zach, who I talk about a lot in the book. And so I did a 3-month research study of Simple Church for my master's thesis. And so then I wrote my whole master's thesis on this church. But in that process, I started connecting with all these other dinner church pastors that had all sort of started about the same time. And all of them had a pretty similar story of they had this weird idea for hosting a church around the table, and it sort of came out of nowhere. And so they convinced a few people, started worshiping in this way, and then learned that there were a handful of others, and they all started to connect. And so as I heard sort of these stories side by side and looked at the timeline, it seemed like, wow, this is not just, I don't think this is just coincidence. I think this is the Holy Spirit is doing something. And so I wanted to sort of be able to tell that story of what the Spirit was doing in this group of churches. And then just in the years since, the idea has really taken off. And there are just dozens and dozens of pastors who have learned from these pastors that are in the book.
I can't remember. I think we ended up starting a dinner church. And obviously during COVID, we did not have it. And we'll talk about that. We ended up, I think it was through Fresh Expressions that we got the idea. Wasn't it,
great.
Chelsea?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you heard of Fresh Expressions?
I have. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was just, we were trying to think of new and unique ways to create a Christian community and also make it accessible. So a big theme for even the collective table is just accessibility for people who, have been hurt by the church or people who are not at all sure what Christianity is. And when you walk in, even whether it's an evangelical church or a liturgical church, it can be overwhelming if you have no Christian experience at all.
Oh, absolutely.
And so we thought, okay, this could be maybe a non-threatening way to engage with Christian content.
And it totally has been. And you talk about in the book about how this, food as this and eating together as this intimate act. And it really just kind of from the beginning breaks down barriers of like, it gives you something to do. It tells you about the person's background. It is just this way to start relationship that is different than if you're sitting next to someone in the pew. It's just a different, and that's probably why the early church, that's what they did, right? Like that had these intimate relationships and communities, and somehow we've moved like far from that, and now we're trying to like come back around almost or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It kind of dismantles some of the like charged nature of trying to get to know someone, that when you're just sort of standing side by side in a pew, it's really hard to sort of start conversation or to even know sort of where to begin. And people sort of feel uncomfortable in their own bodies, feel uncomfortable knowing where to start conversation. But if you're sitting at a table, your body is a little bit more at ease. And there's at least sort of topics of conversation more naturally built in that kind of can serve as a starting point for deeper relationship.
Especially the Simple Church because what we do is it's kind of invitation because we usually host it at somebody's house, but is it kind of open door policy? Like anybody who finds it can kind of walk through the door?
Yeah, anyone can come. They're in the suburbs. They're about 45 minutes outside of Boston, so it's not quite as big of a town. So this church itself, they they bake bread to support themselves financially, and then they sell the bread at the farmers market. So that's how they really meet a lot of people. A lot of folks that attend got to know them through the farmers market, and first through eating their bread and then coming to the service regularly after that.
I love that. I was going to ask, have you done any research or any thoughts on like what happened during COVID with the dinner church experience, and where do you see it going now that I think we're coming out, we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about what that's looked like over the last year for us.
Yeah, so I actually caught back up with several of the pastors in the church after COVID hit to hear about what they were doing and see sort of how things had transitioned. And I did write about it in Christian Century, so I do have a piece that sort of outlines it if you want to read a little bit more deeply. A lot shifted into virtual gatherings, and actually found that they were able to shift fairly naturally. Obviously, things did not feel the same. Sharing a meal over camera is not the same as sharing a meal in person, but some of the gifts of they were used to having these more intimate conversations. They were used to sort of this awkward and new way of doing things. They were used to experimenting because that had already been built into the rhythms of their church. So then when they shifted to a virtual setting, a lot of the sort of things that were required of churches were already natural to that community. And so they were able to make the transition in some ways very, very well. There are other ways in which it was just, of course, unsatisfying because virtual worship is unsatisfying. Right. And in some ways, I think when you are used to eating together as worship and really thinking about how much embodied relationship and worshiping with your full body is really valuable, I think it does actually make the virtual nature even more unsatisfying in some ways. So I think there was kind of a tension where the creativity and unique way of doing things and openness to experimentation were to their benefit, but the disembodied nature of it was really hard.
That makes sense. But I love the way you prefaced it with saying that they were comfortable with change and with trying different things and experimenting. And so that really gave them some foundational space to go into this virtual experience, which you're absolutely right. It's not going to be the same. I mean, like there's just, even here, like I wish we were all sitting around a table right now, right? Eating some of your bread, but because I love the way you phrase that. So that's great. But I do think it would be good to talk a little bit about the intentionality of the eating process and food. So I don't know. I think Chelsea had some thoughts on, how can food be intentional?
There are many ways in which eating can both help to build community, but it can also help to break down community. Eating, that intimacy can both be very valuable in building community, but that intimacy can also make it very easy to hurt one another through the process of eating, or by not paying attention to sort of the complexities of our relationships to food. And so I think it's sort of that, I don't know if double-edged sword is quite the right metaphor, but it can be valuable, but it can also break things down. And so I think there's an importance to really being intentional in the ways that we eat together, so that we can make sure our eating is oriented towards building community rather than breaking it down. One of the most helpful and difficult ways to do this right now is really thinking about food allergies and really thinking about, I think our ability to eat together has been hindered in many ways in the last several years as food allergies have really grown. And so it's really easy to think that this is a hindrance to our community building around the table, because if we can't all eat the same thing, or, someone has to either can't eat with the group or has to bring their own food, that creates this sort of separation that works against the power of all eating together. But at the same time, I think actually getting to know the people in the specific community that you're a part of and learning how to cook for one another and learning how to address one another's needs by preparing food that the group can eat together can be a really powerful way of using food intentionally to build community, to express love to those who might feel sort of separated or out of place in this way.
Oh, I love that.
That was super helpful for me because whenever you just started talking about how food can be a hindrance, I'm thinking how. I just think of food as this gathering thing, but you're totally if people are vegan or allergies are so prevalent, but also the way that they can feel loved and cared for when you consider that. That was really helpful to frame that. And I think that you can show love through that way.
Yeah, I do. When I've done sort of dinner church trainings with pastors who are thinking about how to start dinner churches, a lot have asked, there's just no way to prepare food that everybody can eat because there's no way to think through all of the allergies these days. And it's impossible to make something that everyone could eat. And my recommendation is always like, we can't think of it sort of in the abstract, what is a food that everyone can eat. Instead, we need to think in the particulars of our community and think, like, what are the needs particular to this community? And then how can I address those needs in the food that I create and develop and
That's so
serve?
cool.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to approach it because I think you're right. I mean, I think, we ask people, what are your dietary restrictions? And we're not asking, I mean, we want to be respectful, but at the same time, I think there is always like, okay, what do I have to, instead of using it as like, this is a way to connect with somebody, learn more about them, be passionate, build community with them, instead of like, oh, woe is me. Right.
Right.
So it's all about how to think about it. What's your approach? I like that. Okay. Oh, that's good. Yeah, that was very helpful. I had never even thought about that.
I have this favorite cupcake place here and where we are in San Diego, and someone brought them to like a baby shower I had a couple years ago, and it was just like the biggest gift to me that they remembered that and went out of their way to like. And so it's reminding me that you can use food as gift, as as flip it, that it's not like a hindrance, or it can be a gift also.
When I think about intentionality with food, which I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about, and really until recently when we started to look into what you were doing and the work you were doing, but we got, and I just posted it on my story today, Chelsea. I don't know if you saw it. We got this thing called Lettuce Grow, and it's a hydroponic. It goes up in height. And I made the best kale salad, and I felt so amazing yesterday. It wasn't that complicated, but I was like, wow, we grew this kale and now we're eating it. It's just, and it's just such there was a lot of intentionality into the process. And so much so that I'm taking pictures of it today and I'm posting it,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly unique that sort of at this point in human history, we are able to be so disconnected from the process of growing and preparing food.
Yes.
Whereas for pretty much all of human history up until the last 50 years or so, 50 or 60 years, there's just been such a deep awareness of all of the labor that goes into the process and just how the process is done, what it takes to prepare food and grow food. And we have, in some ways, it's a huge gift that we've been able to be separated somewhat from that, because it means that we have a lot of time in our days to do other things and a lot of sort of space for pursuing other passions or interests that we might have, right. Especially as women. I think a lot about how as women, like, we have a lot of freedom because of so much of sort of how the food system is developed. But at the same time, we have this separation that humans have never had before from the process of growing food. And so it keeps us from really being able to both respect, I think, the labor that goes into it, but also to celebrate sort of the delightfulness of the fact that what we eat is grown out of almost nothing. It still is crazy to me, looking out at a garden, that this food just grows out of a seed. It's wild, but we are able to be so separated that we don't even have to think about it. And so then in some ways don't even get to sort of really celebrate it.
Yeah. And I think it helps. I have kids. And so being able to share that with them, to help them think about, and it's hard, right? Because their brains are not thinking about that. But I actually I purchased your curriculum for the family. So I'm hoping we're going to do that with them. But it does. And I also, I know this may sound crazy, but I do think even the baking shows that are on nowadays help kids think about the beauty in food, the sacredness in food, and all the effort that goes into creating it. It's, a true art form. And so, hopefully we're finding ways to connect back to it, because I think you're right. We've been disconnected.
Yeah. When I was a kid, it's just like, oh, food shows up on your plate, right? Like it's no thought process, except that my mom had to go to the grocery, also those parts that you're talking about, like with women's responsibilities and stuff too. But yeah, I think that's really true. And I think I wanted to ask you about like the art of, or the act of cooking together. And if you've had any kind of experience, like I was just thinking about how intimate and beautiful that experience can be. And if you've had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a huge gift and value to the process of cooking together. It is part of how we tell stories. It's part of how we sort of share our knowledge and our education with others, especially sort of within families. As you know, as parents teach their children or grandparents teach their grandchildren how to cook, there's this transference not just of knowledge in the kitchen, but also of knowledge of sort of family and of culture and um, stories that are shared in that process of cooking together. And I think the same thing happens when, as a church, we cook together. If we think about sort of the meals that are shared, in some ways that happens in sort of a potluck setting where people might be able to share their recipes and talk about sort of the family stories that are expressed through food on the table. But there's an even deeper layer of that happens through cooking together.
And you were I think you said in your book, or it was maybe on a different podcast, but the potluck where everybody has opportunity to kind of have ownership over the meal and participate in no matter what they bring, but they're bringing something, and then they have this investment into it. And I kind of think that's the same thing of like cooking, like you have an
Mhm.
investment into the meal, that your
Yeah.
participation is necessary, and your whatever you're giving potluck, that it's necessary for the meal to be complete.
Yeah, you help to create sort of the setting that you're in, and there's a deep sense of sort of ownership that comes with that.
So, how did edible theology come about? Where did that birth from?
I love that pairing of those two words. That is just like the most beautiful combination of words.
I was gonna say, I was doing I co-facilitated a Bible study before we came on this, and I was told them, I said, okay, we're going to do our first interview, and this woman, she's created edible theology, and they're like, what is this? So it just putting those words together is magical.
Oh, yes, I love it. I love it. I think when I went to go to seminary, I was trying to think through like what is it that I'm doing? I'm doing theology, but it's not just sort of theology and the ways that I think about theology and write about theology. I really want to express that it's not just something we do in our head, but something that we do with our bodies. And so that's where sort of the phrasing came from, the edible theology sort of idea. And it started as a newsletter. I started it as a newsletter 3 years ago. And it was just a monthly newsletter where I was writing some reflections on food and faith. And it grew really rapidly. And so after my book came out, after We Will Feast came out, I started wanting to think through how can I really sort of deepen the resources that I offer, and that all just sort of grew from there. So we offer a whole host of resources right now for dinner church pastors or people who are interested in starting dinner churches, but also on bread baking workshops and curriculum on the Bake with the Bible curriculum on looking at stories of bread throughout the Gospels. And yeah, it still has a lot of growth left to do. I have lots of sort of exciting ideas and resources that we're going to keep developing.
That's what I was going to say. What does the future hold for it?
Yeah, so well, right now I'm working on my next book, and so that's sort of the bulk of my focus at the moment. But we're continuing to develop more workshops. So I teach monthly workshops on bread baking, but then also we have a new community that's going to be launching in June, a membership community where you can join the community and you get additional monthly reflections, food and faith reflections and recipes, but also access to a whole community of folks where we'll do monthly, we're calling them baker's hours calls, where you can ask your baking questions, but also sort of theological questions to spark some of these theological conversations. And then in this fall, we'll launch a book club as part of that community where we'll actually read together cookbooks and some theology books, some food studies books, various things that look at sort of these ideas of edible theology from a variety of fields and perspectives. And so my hope is that sort of in this community, we'll learn together and bake together, and practice theology with our bodies together, but also help to further these conversations on food and faith a little bit more.
We are trying to make Christianity accessible, which I think we mentioned earlier. But when you're talking about baking in the Gospels, I wonder if you could just elaborate on that and talk a little bit about what that means.
Yeah. So bread is sort of this image and symbol that's used throughout the entire narrative of Scripture, but it's especially prevalent in the Gospels. Throughout the life of Jesus, there are many stories of bread being used in different ways. And so Bake with the Bible my goal was to really look at the ways that bread is used in scripture and have a series of Bible lessons on bread. And I decided to focus on the Gospels just because there were so many stories that we had to focus them somewhere. And so we have 6 lessons that are drawn from 6 different Gospel stories around bread. And through those stories, we're looking at the story, and the beginning of each lesson is drawn from sort of the practices in godly play, which is a Montessori style Sunday school program that's really directed at sort of sparking children to really think about the story. We use the phrase, I wonder. I wonder, what Jesus might have felt when he was tempted in the desert. I wonder what it felt like for his stomach to be growling after 40 days of not eating. And so really trying to sort of help to think about how did the characters in these stories experience these stories. And then from there, we have a little bit of a gospel lesson. And then we also have a variety of activities to help deepen these lessons so that kids and teens, there's a teenage version and children's version, but so that they can start to think about how these lessons integrate into other aspects of their life. And then we also have cultural and historical lessons about bread. So understanding the role of bread in the broader scope of human history. And then there are recipes with each of them too. So the goal is that we think about the stories of bread in scripture, but that it's not just sort of this disconnected thing, that we use the bread to help us understand better who we are and how we fit within sort of the world, and how God speaks to us through bread.
Yeah, very intentional process. I was thinking of a question before when you were talking about creating these communities. What are do you find that in the community that exists right now, what kind of challenging questions or theological conversations do you find yourself in as it relates to food? I mean, are there things that stand out for you that you're like, as we move forward and continue to do this ministry, because it is a ministry, these are things that we have to be able to address.
I like to think of that food is always both this sign of the brokenness of creation and also God's commitment to healing creation. That through food we see the many repercussions of sort of the brokenness of creation, but we also have this ability to be participants in the work of justice and of healing creation. And so there are, in talking about food, we cannot escape conversations around climate change. We cannot escape conversations around racism and racial injustice in the food system, but also racism and racial injustice in as far as the history of agriculture, but also eating disorders and our relationships to our own bodies, to food insecurity, and the ways that connects with climate change, but also with racism, that everything fits together. Conversations around gender and who is involved in the work of cooking food and preparing food and distributing food, and how do all of these aspects intersect with one another. And so there are ways in which we can use food to address these injustices and these areas of brokenness within creation. And there are ways that we can use food to further these injustices and these points of pain. But then there are also ways in which we can recognize that we cannot extricate ourselves from the brokenness of creation. And so we are always sort of engaging in this good and this bad, and trusting that God is also with us in this work and participating in the work of healing creation. So I think there's just a lot of room for further conversation around, I think food is an entry point to these hard conversations. And also these hard conversations have to happen around our relationship to food.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. Yeah. You're in that tension. You're holding that space of, there's positive things, but there's also things that we need to work on. We need to change. We need to be a part of, we need to fight. And using food to create that space. That's great. So creating communities where you can have those authentic, vulnerable conversations to kind of move forward. Yeah. Yeah. I like that. Okay, good. That's what I was wondering.
The interconnectedness of all of those things is something Dana and I struggle with and try to, it's like you can't, where do you start? It's like they're so interwoven with one another. And so maybe you have some suggestions about how an individual can use food as a means of creating justice in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really easy to get caught up in this idea of like, how do I eat the best possible way that,
Yeah.
cares for my body and cares for creation and cares for
Yeah.
all these layers of the systems. And the truth is there isn't just a way that we can eat. And, our eating cannot be ethically pure or cannot be sort of
Right.
ethically perfect in any way because we live in a creation that is groaning for redemption. And so I think starting by freeing ourselves from that pressure and first thinking about sort of where are the points of shame that I feel in relationship to food and how can I work against that? Maybe it's my relationship to my own body and an inability to see food as this delightful good thing because I only think about how it impacts, the appearance of my body. Maybe it is allergies and struggling to see food as good because food actually hurts me physically to eat. There maybe it is have your family has a difficult history with the land and a difficult history with, the ways that your family has been controlled through your relationship to land. And so healing can look like really sort of seeing the goodness of gardening and of farming and of growing food. So I think it is a very individual and communal sort of thing on where you should start. But I think look at where do you experience the brokenness and the pain here the most, and how can you first address that and then work outwards from there.
Oh, I love that. Amen. That is but yeah, I mean, these are really complicated things to talk about, but we have to. We've got to name them. We've got to identify, where it sits with us, yeah, I think it's super powerful. So thank you. It's a great way to approach.
Yeah, we often talk about like, the inner work leads to the outer work.
Outer work.
So it's able to kind of cultivate like what is that in me, where like you were saying like the pain points or the joy or whatever, and then you're able to move from that place of the like where you're healed to help to heal in the world.
Well, because if we can't see food as good, if we can't see the process of eating as good, the process of sharing food with others as good, and the process of growing food as good, then there's just no way that we can work towards that goodness in other areas too. As it relates to food. So we really do have to. You have to start, yeah, exactly as you said. That inner work can lead to more outer work.
Yeah, you need the starting place.
I always go back to Genesis chapter 1. God said everything's good. We've got to go. We've got to see that as
Amen.
good. Yeah.
Amen. Yes.
Amen.
Yes.
Actually, I think you say in your book the only thing God says that is not good is that we're by ourselves, and so the reminder that we do this work together. I thought that was an interesting reflection. Like, yeah, that we're created to be together, and we're called to do this work together, and it is so communal. Which brings me to the chapter on loneliness that you have in your book. Even before COVID, scientists were calling us the loneliest generation. Like, no matter where you live or how many people you're surrounded by, or like we just have this barrier of vulnerability, I think, that keeps us kind of siloed no matter who we are, who surrounds us. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ways in which we can intentionally use food to move in that unlonely or more connected space.
I think this has, of course, been just absolutely amplified in the last year. And actually, when you ask sort of where do you see things heading after COVID, I think I see church meals being even more integral to sort of our life moving forward. And in some ways, I think people being more primed for them because we cannot ignore anymore the intensity of this loneliness that has sort of shaped our culture. So I think it is this intentionality of being together, of sitting down together, of embracing the awkwardness sometimes of that process, that vulnerability and addressing loneliness go hand in hand. And this is sort of the difficulty of vulnerability and intimacy, that it is necessary. Vulnerability and intimacy are necessary in order to be known and have our needs met. And yet also when we open ourselves up to vulnerability and intimacy, we open ourselves up to the potential to being hurt. And so recognizing that we hold power in sort of our relationship to others, and that we have to value the vulnerability and intimacy that others share with us, and in the same way hope that they also value that in the same way and respect us and treat us tenderly and carefully. And so I think the table is a really valuable way to help step into that vulnerability and intimacy in a way that's a little bit less charged, and allows us to sort of see the needs of others and help to address the needs of others, and we have to just go into it recognizing this is going to be awkward, but that awkwardness is way better than the pain of loneliness, and that it is worth it to step into that awkwardness and discomfort, and the potential to be hurt is worth it to step out of loneliness and into community.
I think a good expectation setting is it doesn't just happen at, one dinner church,
Yeah, and
you
it
know.
can't, right? Like it's funny. I think sometimes we expect sort of community in a church to function in this very unnatural way, whereas like you would never expect a friend that you meet in any other setting to like suddenly be open to tell you your whole life story and, be feel comfortable and safe telling them your whole life story, and in the same way that's not how church works either. That you can't expect to just show up at church and be able to like air everything, and people be able to hold that carefully and tenderly. And in the same way, you can't expect someone else to come in and just be willing to open up everything, all of their trauma and stories to you, and be able to handle that tenderly. But allowing yourselves to go through this long process and slow process of getting to know one another and just committing to that slow formation of deep community. But I think exactly as you said, it is sort of a cyclical process. And I've seen this both in churches that where sort of the primary need is community. So St. Lydia, sort of the primary need of most of the church members there was community. There was a deep sort of loneliness that was true among lots of young professionals living in New York City. And so that's what this church attempted to address, was that loneliness. There are other churches where sort of the primary need that they're attempting to address is food insecurity or housing insecurity. But it's the same sort of pattern in those contexts where, this initial need is being met because food is being offered at the table. And as that food is being offered, then there's a little bit more room to open up about, here is sort of the reality of my situation. And as there's some opening up about need, and then those needs are met by community, there's this safety to open up a little bit more. And so it creates this cycle that allows deeper vulnerability, because as people are vulnerable, those needs are being met, and it becomes safer and safer to continue opening up, knowing that those needs are going to be addressed.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the whole dinner church process, and forget even dinner church, like just being able to sit down at a table with other people. You're right. You're not going to immediately tell your deep, darkest secrets but it starts just a feeling of we're together. We're connected, we're together. And so the setting, the whole, context of it, I think it's just versus walking into a church and sitting in a pew by yourself.
Yeah.
I don't know. So that's why I think I just love the idea of church around a table, or church around a comfortable area where you're sharing food that you've all contributed to and been a part of. There's just something that says, okay, now we can start this. It's going to take time. It's going to be a process, but we can start this. So anyway.
And I think, Dana, like what you were saying, it's like you could come in and out of church in a pew and no one know your name.
Nope.
You cannot sit around the table and not know people's names. Like
That's
at
right.
least it gives you that starting point of like seeing each other. Like you can sneak in and out of church with no one even seeing you.
Yeah,
and
right.
so
Absolutely.
at a table you're seen and you're at least known by name. And so there's like the starting place is just a different starting place.
Yeah. Oh. All right.
But it can be intimidating. And I'm wondering if any of our listeners are like thinking, okay, I want to try a dinner church, like, but it's awkward. Like, what advice do you have for people who are dipping their toe into maybe a dinner church?
Mm-hmm. My recommendation always is to start by looking at the community that you're in, and really assessing what is the need in this community that I'm attempting to address here. Is the need one for community? Is the need one for sort of a spiritual care for those who have felt rejected by the church? Is the need actually like the physical need for food? Is it addressing food insecurity? What is sort of the hunger and the need of the community that you're a part of? And then how can you use the dinner church to address that? Because it's going to look very different. What you do is going to look different based on the community you're in and the needs of your community.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. If you want like some really practical step-by-step, I do have an online course through Edible Theology that really talks you through and gives some sort of a lot of exercises to help do some of that assessment of the community that you're in. Or if you are sort of a traditional church that wants to start a dinner service, to really help think through how to do that well. There are lots of practical steps that sort of you can go through to help figure that out. Yeah.
When reading your book, you can see all the different examples of the different ways in the communities and what dinner church looked like for them. But is there a commonality? Like, they're very different communities and pastors and who is attending in the ways, but like, what would you say is like a commonality between dinner churches?
I mean, I think really the main point of connection is just this commitment to sharing a meal together. There's so much else that's different. I chose the churches that are in the book specifically to represent a wide range of geographic locations, of denominational traditions, theological traditions, a wide range of church sizes, small and large. So there's purposefully a lot of variance represented within the book. And really one main point of connection is that they're sharing a meal together, and that they understand this in some way connects to Christ's command that we eat and drink together in remembrance of him.
That's a perfect starting place, right? That grounding.
I mean, I just think that this is really thinking strategically about food, thinking carefully about food is going to be really important in the months and years to come, as we really, we've endured a traumatic year together. And there's a lot to process together communally. And I think there's a lot of concern among maybe many pastors that it will be really hard to get momentum going sort of in the church after this, that church decline was already sort of active and underway, and that this has just sort of accelerated that. But at the same time, I actually think that this is a really meaningful, there's a lot of potential moving forward, that a lot of our needs have been sort of expressed in such a way that we can no longer hide them. The need of the church to address these areas of injustice, the need of the church to address this deep loneliness. And I think that the church can address these things. I think this is what the church is intended to address. And sharing meals together, baking bread together is a way of really getting at the deep sort of embodied needs that we share, and that the church can really step in. And so I want to encourage, especially, pastors and other folks in ministry, that I think there's a lot of opportunity here, that I think that God is at work in this and can bring about lots of healing through this.
Yeah. And I think I think we're Chelsea, and I don't even know if we always name it, but I think just being able to share and talk about different ways to do ministry, ways to be flexible, ways to adapt, ways to just think differently. And if you have that capacity, the opportunity is there, the ability to connect with people where they are and meet them in their spaces. And I think this is a wonderful example of being able to do that.
Yeah, the way you phrase that too, I mean, the meal gets to address so many of those complicated issues of loneliness to justice to, the message of the gospel. And so it's just so multi-layered, the ways, the complications of the world, but also the ways in which we can answer with food. So Kendall, thank you so much. This was such a beautiful conversation. We've enjoyed your work for a long time and excited to get into the curriculum, but we're just really grateful.
I was gonna say, I'm so excited for what's coming, because this sounds really exciting. So I will be in it. I'm sure Chelsea will be in it, but we're excited to see, where the future goes. But what a wonderful ministry. So you're just a blessing. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you guys so much. Thank you for having me. I love being able to have these conversations. So
I'll let you know when I'm in Durham.
Perfect. Please do. Please do. Yes, I am here. So I would love to, can't wait to be able to see people in person.
Excellent.
Here soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. Just like everyone we are interviewing throughout this series reflects the sacred and holy image of God, so do you. Together, we are what God looks like.
The Collective Table is supported by San Diego United Methodist Church in Encinitas, California.
A big thank you to the team at Castos, especially our producer Stuart Barefoot and our content editor Claire Watson.
The original music heard in this episode was created and performed by Mystic Mercy.
Make sure to subscribe to the podcast, YouTube channel, and our newsletter.
If you'd like to financially support the work of The Collective Table, please visit thecollectivetable.org. There you can also find out more about who we are and view past episodes.